My golden child brother took credit while I kept the company alive. When I asked for a stake, Dad kicked me out, but my quiet exit with proof, timing, and one unexpected ally reversed every power move they thought untouchable. I'm 33, male, Atlanta Stage Facilities Tech, also known as the guy who keeps film sets from melting. Dad's been running the Jake is the Future program since diapers, and I've been the ghost in the ducks doing the actual saves. No decade-long recap of the Golden Child franchise. Fast forward to now. Work finally tipped from unfair to clown show. I asked for a stake, Dad tried to boot me, and I hit the big red end scene button with receipts. I've worked at my dad's company for a long time. We're in Atlanta handling the technical side of film and TV studio facilities. Basically, we keep stages online. HVAC, power, cooling, and all the random stuff that can shut down a production if it fails. It's not glamorous, but it's specialized, and not many people know how to do it right. I'm one of the people who can. My brother Jake, on the other hand, doesn't touch any of that. He's the business guy. Contracts, spreadsheets, phone calls. He sits at a desk or on his laptop while I'm crawling through ducts or sweating next to a compressor that's about to quit. But in Dad's eyes, Jake is the future, and I'm just labor. That's the theme around here. One morning, I got to the shop at 6:15. Stage 3 had a breaker that tripped during the night, and the whole stage would have been down if I didn't reset it. I reset it, balanced the load, logged it, and the stage was back online before 6:30. Dad walked in right after that. Jake wasn't even in yet, still at home. Dad looked at the order board, saw that stage 3 was cleared, and said out loud, "Good job, Jake, keeping everything on track." Jake hadn't done a thing. I just stared at him because this wasn't once in a while. It happened all the time. I'd fix something, Jake would get the credit. Nobody even blinked because that's just normal here. Later that same day, I went to grab my manifold gauge set from the cage. It's mine. I bought it myself and even logged the serial number as proof. Dad walked by, saw me carrying it, and said, "Why are you using company property for side work?" I told him it was mine, not the shop's. He waved me off and said, "If it's in this shop, it belongs to the company." That's how he talks. Meanwhile, Jake had just gotten a new laptop on the company card. Nobody called that company property. Nobody asked why he needed it. Nobody checked if he used it for personal stuff. I didn't bother arguing. I just snapped another photo of the serial tag to add to my file because I've learned the only way to protect myself is to keep proof. If you walk through our office hallway, it's even more obvious. There's a wall covered with framed photos and magazine clippings. The wall is full of Jake's ribbon cuttings and handshakes, while my biggest projects just show up as anonymous team achievements. Talk, which means Jake's face with a clipboard while I'm somewhere behind the wall, duct taping a solution until parts arrive. I'm invisible on that wall. If you didn't know better, you'd think Jake was the one sweating through jobs while I was just some helper. Even the parking lot proves the point. Jake has a reserved spot with his name painted on the curb. I don't. Every morning I loop the block trying to find a spot, then haul gear across half a block to the shop. By the time Jake shows up mid-morning, he pulls into his reserved spot and strolls in. That's the setup. That's how it is every single day. A couple weeks before I finally decided I'd had enough, I sat down with Dad in his office. His desk was stacked with files and invoices. I told him flat out, I know I'm not management material. I don't want to run the company, but I keep the actual jobs from falling apart. I asked for some kind of stake, not half, not control. Just something that said I was more than labor. Like 15% non-voting shares or phantom equity or profit sharing. I wanted a path, something that tied me to the future of the business. Dad looked at me and said, "There's only room for one captain. Jake's been preparing for this since he was a kid. Estate planning has to be simple." I asked what that meant for me. He said, "You'll be taken care of when I'm gone." That was it. He basically told me my reward for years of work would be inheritance when he dies. I reminded him that I was the one actually keeping the equipment online and the clients happy. He said, "You were never going to carry this name." That was the line that told me he'd already decided who mattered and who didn't. At that point, I'd been collecting proof. Screenshots of work orders with my initials, photos of tools I bought with the serial numbers visible, timestamps showing I was at the shop before dawn while Jake was still at home reviewing contracts. I knew one day it might matter because this wasn't something that could be brushed off. It was built into everything. Jake was always going to be the golden brother, and I was always going to be treated like I was disposable. It didn't matter if I fixed a stage that saved a production from losing millions. In Dad's story, Jake did the heavy lifting. That's the world I was living in. That's the baseline of how things worked at the company. After that, I knew where I stood, and that's when I decided I was going to hand in my notice. After that conversation with Dad, I decided I was done. I wrote up a formal resignation letter, gave 4 weeks' notice, and dropped it on his desk one afternoon. I thought it was the respectful way to do it. Give him plenty of time to replace me, train somebody, whatever. Dad read it, looked up at me and said, 2 weeks is generous for a cashier. I told him I was giving 4, not 2. He didn't even acknowledge. Just muttered something about how Jake would figure out scheduling without me. That was his reaction. Years of work, dozens of jobs I kept alive, and he brushed me off like I was quitting a grocery store gig. I walked out of the office, kept my head up and got back to work. No point in arguing. I knew where I stood. That same week, I got called to a night emergency at stage 7. It was about 1 in the morning when the alert came through. The stage was climbing in temperature fast. I drove out there, checked the system, and found one of the valves half closed. It wasn't broken. It had been turned that way. I don't know who touched it or why, but it was enough to push the system toward failure. Productions lose their minds if a stage gets too hot or too cold. People panic about condensation, cameras fogging, talent refusing to shoot. I had maybe an hour to get it under control before the whole schedule blew up. I grabbed parts from the truck, built a temporary bypass, and logged the readings as the temperature started dropping back to normal. I took photos of the setup, screenshotted the temp charts, and sent the incident report, all before sunrise. By the time Dad showed up, the crisis was already over. He walked in, saw everything online, and told the crew, "That's why Jake's scheduling works." Jake hadn't even been there. He was at home asleep. I bit my tongue. Evan, the client rep, had been on site during the emergency watching me work. He was the one who saw me build the bypass and take the readings. After I finished, he told me he was sending my notes to Nolan, the studio's facilities director. He said, "You're the only reason they didn't cancel today." That was the first time I realized somebody outside the family actually noticed what I did. The next morning, I was in the loading dock when Evan walked up. He asked me if I wanted to grab coffee later in the week. He said Nolan wanted to talk about something, and it wasn't the kind of thing they could just ask over the phone. I didn't ask what it was about, but I had a feeling. I told him sure. I figured it couldn't hurt to hear him out. I didn't tell Dad or Jake anything about it yet. Not until I knew what it actually was. The rest of the week dragged. I kept showing up, finishing out my notice while everyone pretended like I was already gone. Jake strutted around the office like he'd already inherited everything. Dad made a point of saying in front of the crew, "This is what happens when people don't see the bigger picture." Everyone knew who he was talking about. I didn't care. I had already decided I wasn't sticking around for another round of being ignored. When I finally met Evan for coffee, he didn't waste time. He told me Nolan had been talking about bringing the facility work in-house for a while, but they hadn't found anyone experienced enough to lead it. He said after the Stage 7 incident, Nolan asked him if I might be interested. I told him I'd need to think about it because technically I was still finishing my time at Dad's shop and I wanted to give my family a fair heads up if anything came of it. Evan said that made sense. He said Nolan wasn't in a rush, but he wanted to meet me soon. That was the point where it clicked that maybe I actually had a way out that didn't involve starting from scratch. I didn't go bragging about it though. I just kept working. If Dad found out I was talking to Nolan, he'd flip. I wanted to see what was on the table first before I said anything. The funny part is none of this would have happened if Dad hadn't written me off completely. If he'd even offered me a small stake or a real path forward, I probably would have stayed. But he didn't. And once I saw how other people valued my work compared to how my own family treated me, I knew there was no turning back. I waited until the following week and sat down with Nolan at a diner off the highway. He didn't waste any time. Said the studio had been talking about bringing all the facilities work in-house for months, but they couldn't find anyone with the right mix of technical skill and experience. He said, "We've seen your logs. Evan showed me the bypass you built at Stage 7. That's the kind of person we need running this." He told me straight that they wanted to hire me to build the department, not just as another worker. They wanted me to lead it, set up systems, hire people, and run it the way it should be run. I told him I was still technically employed at my dad's shop, finishing my notice. Nolan said he understood and wasn't asking me to break anything. He said HR could set up a paid trial through a staffing vendor so it wouldn't overlap with Dad's contracts. I said I'd need to think about it and that I planned on telling my family before anything was official. Nolan nodded and said, "That's the right move, but if you're interested, we're serious." I left that meeting and decided I should at least give Dad and Jake the courtesy of knowing what was going on. Not because they deserved it, but this is business, and I'm committed to being loyal to my job. I walked into the office the next morning and told them Nolan had talked to me about possibly building an in-house team. Dad leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said, "That's poaching by proxy." Jake was sitting next to him with a folder already ready to slide across the desk. Inside was a counteroffer. They called it Director of Field Ops. The title looked fancy, and there was a small raise and a retention bonus. But as I read through the packet, I saw the clause tucked in the middle. It was a multi-year non-compete that said I couldn't work in the industry at all if I left. I circled it with my pen and pushed it back to Jake. I said, "So basically you're trying to keep me chained here without giving me any real stake." Jake smiled like he was proud of the trick. Dad said, "Men who lead don't read every clause. They sign and commit." I told them I wasn't signing it. Jake tried to say the clause was standard, but I'd already seen enough. That was the end of that conversation. That afternoon, I sent Nolan and HR a PDF I'd been keeping. It had everything in it. Emails showing Evan contacted me first, work order logs with my initials, invoices for the tools I bought with my own money, and screenshots of timestamps showing I was there before dawn most days. I didn't want any question about whether I'd approached them or stolen clients. HR replied within the hour and said they'd handled the trial through a third-party vendor to avoid any conflict. They told me it would be a 72-hour assessment on a stage that Dad's shop didn't service. When I showed up for the trial, they had a stage offline that needed to be brought up by Monday morning for a commercial shoot. It wasn't just one issue, it was half the system. They gave me 3 days, a budget for parts, and the authority to call in whatever vendors I needed. I got to work. I mapped the work, rushed in parts, delegated smaller tasks, and by day 3 the stage was back online. Cooling held steady and everything was logged with readings and photos. Monday morning, the commercial team walked in and never even knew the place had been down. Nolan stopped by and looked over the logs. He nodded, said, "This is exactly why we wanted you." Evan told me the studio execs were already talking about a permanent position. That night, while I was finally heading home, I saw my phone blowing up. The industry newsletter had run a piece with the headline, "Studio Poaches Family Tech," and it painted it like I'd been sneaking behind Dad's back to steal his biggest client. I knew immediately where that came from. Dad and Jake had been talking. The next morning, I found out for sure. A guy I know at another shop texted me and said Jake forwarded him the article with a note about me being untrustworthy. I didn't respond. Instead, I sent the article to HR and attached the PDF I'd already given them. They replied again saying, "We have the full timeline. Don't worry about it. We'll handle any noise." Meanwhile, at the shop, Dad called a meeting with the crew. I walked in halfway through and caught him saying, "This is what betrayal looks like." He didn't say my name, but he didn't need to. Jake was standing beside him, shaking his head like some disappointed politician. They were clearly trying to paint me as the villain before I left. I didn't waste time arguing or giving a speech. I just said, "If you're going to point at someone, make sure you've got the finger for it." Then I clocked in and went back to work. I didn't argue. I just did the work I was assigned. The funny thing was, a couple of the guys came up to me later that day and said, "We know who's been keeping this place together, don't sweat it." That was all I needed to hear. By the end of the week, Nolan called me and said the trial had sealed it. He said they wanted to move forward with a full-time offer. Sent the paperwork the next day. It was a W-2 position, not a contract, with a 90-day probation, annual retention bonus, benefits, and authority to hire 2 people under me. It spelled out everything clearly, and there wasn't a single line about a non-compete. They even added a clause saying any tools I bought myself would remain mine. I hadn't even thought to ask for that, but they included it anyway. While I was looking over the offer, another email came through. It was from Jake forwarding the same industry article again. This time to me directly with the message, "Hope this was worth burning your family." I didn't reply. I just saved it into the same folder with all the other receipts. By the time the 4th week rolled around, the tension in the shop was thick enough that even the new guys were picking up on it. I'd already signed the studio offer, but my start date wasn't until after my notice ended, so technically I was still on Dad's payroll. Everyone knew I was leaving, but nobody said it directly. It was just sideways looks and conversations that stopped the second I walked into the room. That morning started like any other. I came in at 7, grabbed the clipboard, and headed to the bay. Half the crew was already standing around looking uncomfortable. And that was weird because usually by then everyone's scattered on jobs. Then I saw Dad and Jake at the front like they were about to give some kind of speech. I thought maybe it was a safety meeting or something, but the way Jake was holding a folder under his arm, I knew it wasn't. Dad cleared his throat and started talking like he was a preacher. He said, "This company was built on loyalty. Everyone here depends on that loyalty. When somebody decides that isn't enough for them, they're not just walking away from a job, they're taking food off everyone's table." He was pacing back and forth like he was addressing a jury, staring at the guys, then staring at me. He didn't use my name, but it didn't matter. Every single person there knew who he was talking about. I just stood there with my arms crossed while the crew glanced between me and him. Some of the guys looked uncomfortable, others just looked tired. They had seen enough of this family drama over the years to know better than to get in the middle of it. Jake finally stepped up and opened the folder. He pulled out a document and held it up like it was a warrant. He said, "We've drafted a cease and desist. If anyone thinks they can take clients away from this business and walk into the competition, they'll find out the law doesn't work like that." Kept waving it like he wanted the whole room to see it. It was such an obvious show that a couple of guys in the back exchanged looks. I didn't say a word. Instead, I pulled my phone out of my pocket, scrolled to Evan's number, and hit call. When he answered, I put it on speaker. I said, "Hey, Dad and Jake are standing here in front of the crew saying I stole your business. Can you clear that up?" The room went dead silent. Evan didn't even hesitate. He said, "Hold on," and I heard muffled voices. A minute later, Nolan came on the line. His voice carried across the bay like he was standing there himself. "We've already documented everything," he said. "We initiated contact with you months ago. We have the emails, the texts, the HR paperwork. We've confirmed you didn't solicit us, you didn't recruit staff, and you've honored your non-solicit clause. If anyone claims otherwise, we're prepared to send the full file." I glanced around and saw the crew staring at Dad and Jake. Nolan kept going. "There's no ambiguity. We have the timeline. We reached out first, and you handled it through proper channels. Anyone saying different is misrepresenting the facts." Evan cut back in. "And for the record, we've got every message on file. Nothing's missing. We're covered." Jake slowly lowered the paper he'd been waving. His face didn't move, but you could tell he hadn't expected Nolan himself to get on the phone. Dad looked furious, red creeping up his neck. For a second, I thought he was going to start shouting, but he didn't. He just stood there gripping the edge of the table like it might break. One of the mechanics in the back muttered under his breath, "Guess Grant got it wrong." The name carried across the room. A couple of others nodded. Nobody laughed, but you could feel the shift. For once, people weren't just quietly swallowing his version of the story. Dad jabbed a finger at me and said, "You've always been a worker, not a leader. Don't fool yourself into thinking you're anything more." I looked at him, then at Jake, still clutching that useless piece of paper, and said, "Funny how you two keep talking about loyalty when you've never once tried earning mine." That shut the room down. I walked to the bench, pulled the old wrench from my pocket, and set it down. "I won't carry what I didn't earn," I said. Then I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and on my way out the door, I turned back just once and added, "Enjoy leading the place now. Let's see how it runs without me." Nobody answered. I didn't even bother finishing the day. I drove straight home, opened my laptop, and signed the studio offer that afternoon. HR countersigned and sent it back within an hour. Start date confirmed for the Monday after my notice. Everything above board, no loopholes. They included the retention bonus, probation period, and the authority to hire 2 people under me. Clean contract, no fine print, nothing like the garbage Jake had slid across the table. Over the next few days, I still showed up because I said I'd work the full notice. Dad barely acknowledged me. Jake acted like I wasn't in the room unless he had some sarcastic comment to throw my way. The rest of the crew kept their heads down. The shop had always been run like a kingdom, and nobody wanted to risk their job by taking sides. You could see in their faces that they knew Dad and Jake had lost credibility after that call on speaker. But nobody was going to challenge him directly. They needed their paychecks. On my last official day, I clocked out, emptied my locker, and left without saying a word. Dad didn't come out of his office. Jake didn't look up from his computer. No handshake, no thank you, nothing. I tossed my shop key on the counter, grabbed my gear, and walked out. I didn't even look back at the bench where the wrench was sitting. Starting at the studio, they gave me a badge, a budget, and told me to make it run. No lectures about loyalty, no strings. Nolan just said, "It's yours now." That was all I needed. On day 1, I walked the stages and realized they were bleeding money. Filters long overdue, gauges off, cooling units running inefficiently. I priced it out and sent Nolan a list. About $85,000 in upgrades across the facility. Within an hour, he forwarded it to the COO and they approved the spend on the spot. First week in, and I was greenlit to move more money than Dad ever let me touch in 10 years. At his shop, I couldn't get approval to order a $300 gauge without a fight. Here I was managing budgets in the tens of thousands without anyone second-guessing me. The real win came 2 weeks later. A network booked a last-minute project that required 3 stages converted to broadcast spec in less than a week. If they missed the deadline, the studio would have lost a contract worth 7 figures. Nolan handed it to me. I ran the numbers, lined up vendors and pulled my crew in. 4 days later, everything was live, tested and stable. The broadcast ran on schedule. The execs congratulated Nolan, and he forwarded me an email from the COO. Whatever changed, keep it. While things were taking off for me, the smear campaign back at Dad's shop was still sputtering. Evan told me that Dad and Jake had called the studio office twice in a week trying to complain about me. HR logged the calls and told them not to contact staff again. A week later, the industry blog that had run the poaching story posted a correction. They said, "Documents show the studio initiated contact." They even published a timeline proving Dad and Jake had been spinning it. That piece got passed around the local shops fast. Guys I barely knew were sending me screenshots with captions like, "Guess the truth came out." Around the same time, I got an email from a vendor. It was about the manifold gauge set Dad tried to claim was company property. The vendor attached the original invoice with my name and the serial number. "Just so you know, we have you as the purchaser," he wrote. I saved it in my folder of receipts. That one email killed any last attempt Dad might have made to claim my tools. By the end of the first month, we had a rhythm. The senior tech handled most of the day-to-day repairs. The apprentice shadowed him and picked up the smaller tasks. I floated between them, checked the logs, and started planning upgrades. We swapped out filters on a rotation, calibrated gauges, and brought the mothball stage back online. Production managers who used to complain about downtime were suddenly thanking us for quick turnarounds. Evan told me one of the execs said, "It feels like we finally have adults running the place." Meanwhile, word trickled in about the shop. A cousin told me they'd had to let 2 guys go because payroll was tight. Another said an inspector had tagged one of the cooling units for being out of spec, and Dad was scrambling to get it fixed before fines stacked up. Someone else texted me a picture of a utilities past due notice taped near the time clock. It didn't surprise me. Without me holding the place together, and with Jake trying to run things off spreadsheets, cracks were bound to show. I didn't celebrate. I just kept working. Every week I sent Nolan a report of what we'd completed, what was pending, and what I recommended for the next month. He forwarded them up the chain. And every time I saw my name in the CC line next to executives I'd never met, it drove home how different this was from Dad's place. There, I was invisible. Here, I was the guy people came to for answers. One day, the apprentice asked me why I kept every invoice, every serial number, every log. I told him because if you don't keep proof, someone else will tell the story for you.
He nodded like it made sense. That was something I learned the hard way at the shop.
And I wasn't about to let it happen here. By the end of the second month, the difference between the two worlds couldn't have been clearer. At the studio, we were hitting every deadline. The equipment was running smooth and management was happy. At the shop, guys were quitting, clients were walking, and Dad was trying to blame everyone but himself. The correction in the blog had burned his credibility, and the constant layoffs made it clear the place was slipping. The day I walked past stage 4 and saw my team running a maintenance cycle without me hovering, I realized I'd finally built something that worked on its own. That had never been possible at the shop. Everything there revolved around Dad's moods and Jake's titles. Here, it revolved around process, proof, and people actually doing the job. That's when I knew I'd made the right call. Starting the broadcast push, Nolan gave me the green light and the budget and said, 3 stages live by Monday. That was it. I mapped the work, ordered parts, and put my guys on shifts. Day 2, the front desk called, "Grant and Jake are here to see Nolan." They walked into the conference room, acting like they owned the building. Evan was already there. Nolan waved me in and told the receptionist to print the visitor log. Jake set a folder on the table and said, "He's under obligations to our company. He can't be here." Nolan looked at me, then at Evan. Evan forwarded an email chain to the room TV, timestamps from months back where the studio reached out to me first. Nolan said, "We initiated contact. He routed everything through HR." Jake slid a paper across the table anyway. Another draft version of the same fake policy he tried to stick me with at the shop. I pushed it back to him and said, "I never signed that." HR stepped in, reminded them of the prior do not contact note, and handed them a written copy. Security was called to stand by. Nolan ended it with, "We have work to do," and the meeting was over in 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, Jake tried a new angle. He emailed the network's production lead claiming conflicts and warning them about me. The production lead forwarded it to Nolan with one line, "Is this real?" I attached the same timeline PDF I'd already given HR, emails, logs, invoices with serials, and replied studio initiated, no solicit, clean start date. Nolan wrote back, "All good," and the network replied, "See you Monday." While parts were landing, they tried one more stunt. Dad called the COO's assistant, asking for a short meeting to protect our mutual interests. The assistant looped legal. Legal answered with a 2-sentence reply and attached the call logs and HR notes. The calendar stayed closed. No meeting. We finished the conversion in 4 days. 3 stages broadcast spec stable. The network walked the rooms, signed the checklist, and left. Nolan forwarded a note from the COO. "Whatever changed, keep it." I replied, "Delivered on time. Budget $82,400. Saved the contract north of 7 figures. By Tuesday, the lobby had a memo posted for reception. If Grant or Jake showed up again, route to security and legal, no exceptions. Evan sent me a screenshot of the entry in the system with their names and the prior incident attached. The same morning, a vendor texted me a photo of a mass email Jake sent around town about me breaching agreements. The vendor's reply was one line. "Send the signed agreement." There wasn't one. Thread died. 2 days later, Dad showed up without an appointment and planted himself in the lobby. Reception rang upstairs. "Grant's here." No meeting on the calendar. By the time I got down, he was shouting about my client and my shop like any of that applied in this building. The receptionist had the visitor policy printed on the desk. Security stood by, waiting for a clean reason to move him. I walked up and kept it simple. "Have a little respect for yourself. This is a workspace. You're not on the schedule, and you're not a vendor here." He tried to restart the speech. I pulled a 20 from my wallet and held it between 2 fingers. "Taxi's cheaper than burning what's left of your reputation." He looked at the bill. "Put the 20 on my inheritance," I said, and set it on the counter. Security opened the door. Dad took the cash, still talking, and they walked him out to the curb. Reception logged the incident number, printed the time, and added "escorted off premises" to the note. The front desk tagged his name in the system with "route to security, legal only." Evan stepped out of the elevator, saw the memo getting stamped, and said, "All set." I nodded and headed back upstairs. HR emailed a minute later with the incident summary and a thank you for keeping it brief. I reopened the queue, signed off the work order I'd paused, and sent the before and after readings. Stages stayed green. The network's add-on day hit the board an hour after that. Rush fee approved. The final blow came when someone sent me a picture of the shop floor with yellow tags hanging from the lathes and the old compressor. An auctioneer had come in and marked everything for sale. A week later, a for sale sign went up on the building. After decades of business, the place was done. I figured that was the end of it. Dad had lost the company. Jake was no longer the heir to anything. And I was finally in a place where people respected my work. But then the call came. It was a Thursday evening, long after we'd wrapped up for the day. My phone buzzed and the screen showed Dad. I stared at it for a second before answering. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He said, "I was wrong to talk to you the way I did. Pride got in the way." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I need a favor." I asked what he wanted. He said, "Take Jake onto your team. He just needs a place to prove himself." I almost laughed. After everything, after the speeches, the threats, the lies, his version of an apology was asking me to hire Jake. Even when he was admitting he'd been wrong, he was still putting Jake first. I told him, "No, we don't hire last names. HR screens for skills. Jake's not getting past the screen. He brings nothing we need. He can't trace a load. Can't read a manifold. Can't run a stage. Our chillers don't run on Excel." "You spent years missing that," he tried to push. Said Jake just needed a shot. I cut him off. "He can apply like everyone else. I'll send him the public posting. I'm not putting a bad hire on my team." Silence. Then Dad said, "I understand," but I hung up. That was the last real conversation we had. When I hung up, I sat back at my desk and looked around. On the shelf was a new wrench in a case with my nameplate. Not Dad's, not Jake's, mine. I locked the case, turned off the lights, and listened as the stage hummed perfectly within spec. That's how it ended. Dad lost the shop. Jake ended up taking a mid-level operations job at a supplier with no equity and no team. And I finally had a place where the work spoke louder than the politics. No speeches, no lectures, no fake titles.